Ireland was considered one of the safer places to live. We seem to avoid many of the serial killers, child abductions and violence that were prevalent even in our next door neighbouring country. Just take a look at Garda Patrol in the 80s or 90s. That's the Irish crime line, and the worst crimes would appear there in order to help police. You will see perhaps an odd armed robbery, but rarely a murder. Mostly things like tools, garden ornaments, jewellery or furniture being stolen. Imagine a garden statue being stolen, making it onto national TV these days. My family made the decision to move back to Ireland from Birmingham in the mid-70s. They took lots of things into consideration when making that decision, one of them being that a small town in Ireland was a safer place to raise their child than Metro Birmingham. Perhaps the Boyle family, who also lived in Birmingham but native of Donegal, thought the same thing when they returned also in the 70s. However, they were to discover that no matter where you go, there are bad people, and sometimes closer to home than you might imagine. In 1977, Mary Boyle, who was an identical twin, was 6 years old. They were not long back from England and went to stay with grandparents in a very isolated area of Donegal. In fact, there were only 2 houses in a 1-mile radius. The day after they arrived, an uncle of the girls was returning a ladder to the only neighbour and made his way to their house through fields with old-fashioned stone walls. He reported that he became aware that Mary was following him, making her way independently over these 3 stone walls. At some point the ground became marshy and he discovered she had turned back. An hour or 2 later, Mary's mother called the kids in and discovered Mary was missing. She and other family members followed the route the uncle had taken, but there was no sign of her. At this point, some anglers called police. It was a close-knit community and lots of people extensively searched, but no trace of her was ever found. Being a close community, people along with the Gardaí noticed that a particular individual was acting strangely. When interviewed by the guards, they thought they had their man, but then received a phone call from an unnamed politician instructing them to drop their interest in this suspect. At this point, they were taken off the case and others assigned it. For years, nothing happened, but when Mary's twin sister grew up, she started to make a commotion. She said everyone knew who was responsible and that it was corruption. A guy already in prison was questioned at this time, and he claims that the crime was tried to be pinned on him, despite him being in the army barracks miles away that day, which was verified, and also he couldn't drive. Another suggestion was that a child molester from England had came over, but there was no proof at all of this, and the chances of someone not local even finding a young child wandering in a field in the middle of nowhere was highly unlikely. Even still, Mary's sister is campaigning for justice, and it is the longest running missing persons case in Ireland. Almost 10 years passed until another child goes missing in a totally unrelated incident. This sent shockwaves of fear and terror to all the parents in Ireland, who thought nothing of letting their kids out to play unattended or to walk back and forth to school. In 1986, 13-year-old Phillip Cairns came home for his lunch. He lived in Rathfarnham near Dublin with a relatively large family. They were a very religious and devout family. He left to return that afternoon but never made it. He wasn't noticed as missing until he failed to arrive home that evening. Philip was reported to have been a good boy, would not mitch off school or get himself into trouble. Now, I know most parents say this about their kids, and there's always a possibility that there's a part of their child's life that they don't know about. But living in Ireland at that time and the mentality that existed and the innocence still present at 13, I would say it was true, and that he would not have got into any kind of misadventure. It was one of the biggest searches ever carried out and one of the biggest stories to ever hit the headlines in Ireland at that time. There were lots of far-fetched theories out there that he'd been abducted by the Moonies, a religious cult that had been apparently recruiting in Dublin that time. Others said he had been abducted by pagans who were going to sacrifice him at the Hellfire Club on Halloween. Indeed, the Gardaí took it so seriously that they stalked it out, and even his parents were under the eye of suspicion, but it all amounted to nothing. The only lead they got was that his school bag turned up in a previously searched area a few days after he disappeared, and it was completely dry despite heavy rain, which pointed to it having been planted there. I personally spoke to his mother Alice in the late 90s, and she never gave up hope. 30 years after he vanished, in 2016, there was a new lead. There was a man who was serving a sentence for rape and sexual assault on young girls, who was on his deathbed. Someone who claimed to have been a victim of his contacted Gardaí to say that she knew who had planted the bag and that she had seen Phillip in the company of this offender on the day he went missing. She said an altercation occurred and Phillip was struck with an object and there was a lot of blood. She passed out, and when she came round she was in the car of the assailant and was far too scared to say anything. The accused was Eamon Cook, a radio mogul of the early days of commercial radio in Ireland back in the 80s. Only one station, which was RTE, the national broadcaster, was legal. They did not cater to the pop market, so a lot of pirate radio stations popped up, the biggest being Radio Dublin, which was owned by Cook. He had a liking for young girls. He used his position to entice, lure and blackmail them for sex. Many of his DJs left after short periods because of his conduct, and anyone who knew him said he was a despicable person who threatened anyone who got in his way. They were mostly very scared of him, as they were certain he would make good on these threats. He was not apprehended until the mid-noughties. You may wonder how he got away with it for so long, but if you lived in Ireland at that time, you'd probably get it. Again, back to Ireland's obsession with not acknowledging or speaking about sex. This resulted in it being done in very low-key, sleazy ways. People couldn't go out and satisfy their fantasies with consenting adults the way they do now. Even if it was an adult they were seeking, it would be done in seedy ways like date rape, manipulation, or coercing sexual favours in return for something the other person wanted or needed. It was all very nasty, and working in the entertainment business at the time, I experienced how rampant it was. Even down to accepting a lift from someone, you could be expected to repay it with a sexual favour. You didn't feel like you had the freedom to say it, as you would be the one who was dirty by talking about it. You were somewhat expected to keep it to yourself. You were safer if you were married, so I sometimes lied that I was and even wore a ring to avoid these kind of encounters. Many had left school and were working at 16 or 17, so a man would see a girl of that age as fair game. If a pervert in a position of power desired a child, he got away with it because kids had it drilled into them to respect authority and their elders, so they felt powerless to speak up or object. As awful as this sounds, if the child was a teenager, it was kind of acceptable that you would get men like this, and it wasn't a rare occurrence. It was sickening and dark that this fell through the cracks for many years, but getting back to the case, many said no, that Cook couldn't have been responsible, as it was only girls he went for, but it's not beyond belief that such a man could have also assaulted boys too. By the time Cook was questioned, his mind was badly deteriorated. He didn't deny any of it, but he didn't confess either. There is still the question of why a boy like Phillip would have gone with Cook. What could have lured him from going to a radio station he had no connection with instead of going back to school? Cook had a very gaudy car with a bull bar and Radio Dublin written badly on both sides of it. If the boy was taken forcibly in broad daylight, would somebody not have seen it?